Hi, I'm Robert Gill. I'm the husband of Rosie, a See You in Heaven book. Some of y'all have seen me before at talks, but I'd like to share with you why the book was written, because many of you that get my email letters do not know the story, and I thought it would be interesting for you to know, be good for you to know. When Rosie died on December the 26th, and that in 2010, and that day was the Feast of the Holy Family, which felt kind of inspired about that. And then at her funeral, they had a lot of people. It was a large church. They had on the altar, most of the time you have one or two priests. They had, I think, 6 or 7 priests, an abbot of the monastery, and had a couple of deacons. And I didn't think much about that until after everything was over, because I was kind of numb from her sudden death. And over the coffin, draped over the coffin, was a quilt that her mother had made for her some years ago. Very country type quilting, checkered pattern. And instead of a family wreath over the coffin, we had pictures of her children and her grandchildren representing her flowers. And after she was buried, I went to confession some days after, maybe a week after, and one of the priests that was on the altar, I heard my confession, and when I walked in, he said, Robert, he says, Rosie is a saint. And I said, yeah, Father, she's a really good person, and that's how I took it. That when you say saintly, it says saintly person, not the big S, capital S. And I didn't think much of that. And then a few weeks later, maybe a month, a priest named Father Angelus Shaughnessy, who is deceased now, he died about a month ago. He was in Pennsylvania, and he called Maria, because he knew Maria and her husband, because Father Shaughnessy was over EWTN's new order that Mother was starting, not EWTN, but he was on EWTN for 10 years back in the 90s. And he told Maria that, he says, Maria, your mother's a saint. Sort of like that priest told me. And Maria said, yeah, she was a really good person, good mother. And Father asked her to write an article about Rosie's life that he could put in. He was the spiritual director of the Confraternity of Catholic Homeschool, Confraternity of Christian Mothers in the United States. And eventually Maria wrote the article, and it was put in several magazines, and then it went into a pamphlet form, and 15 to 17,000 pamphlets were spread all over the United States. A lot of priests was using it for they were using it for Mother's Day to give out. Well, anyway, that's how the message of Rosie's life kind of got out a little bit. A year or two later, excuse me, a priest from the Philippines, who was opening up a monastery in Cullman County, had read the pamphlet, and he came to me and he said, Robert, he says, your wife, Rose, is a saint. And again, I just said, yeah, she's a real good mother, real good woman, real good wife. And he says, no, she's a saint. I said, what do you mean, Father? He said, I think she's a saint. I'd like for you to go talk to Bishop Baker, Bishop of Birmingham, and tell him that I said that. And so I didn't go talk to the bishop right away. I didn't even know the bishop. And about 6 months later, I talked to several priests and told them what Father Bing said, what other priests had said. And one priest told me, he said, I think you need to go just share that with Bishop Baker. And so I did. And I was nervous and apologetic about even talking to him about her. And anyway, and he said, yeah, I read the article too. And he said, we need to write a book. He says, get your daughter that wrote this pamphlet or this article to write a book. And he says, and he looked through paper, pictures, and all that stuff I had of Rose in a yearbook. And he said, we need pictures in there, so if she would be called to be a saint, that young people would know that she's a woman of our time. So he picked out pictures of her being a cheerleader and class beauty. He says, that way they don't think that she's from the 1500s or so. And so we started working on that, and it several months later, probably 6 months later, Father Bing was back in our diocese at this monastery, and I made an appointment. I went and talked to him, and he said, I want to tell you, he says, the reason I kind of told you to go talk to the bishop about Rosie being a saint. He said, back in the early 90s, when we were starting this religious order, which this order has about 1,000 people that he started, and it's to restore the family But John Paul II had encouraged me to start this religious order, and he'd visit the Pope. He's told me every 3 months. And at one visit he had, he said the Pope told him, he says, "Father, you're all over the world, you're visiting with families and all that." He says, "See if you can find me a saint, a mother who is a traditional mother who is a saint, that we can look into her life." He says the church needs a traditional saint, a traditional mother that's a saint. And he says, when I read this article, he said, "This is it." He said, God was telling me, and he looked up and he says, John Paul II, Saint John Paul, he says, "We found your saint." And then I told the bishop about that story too. And so then I started having to say, well, maybe God is calling her to be a saint. I don't know. And we started writing a book, and we didn't know how good of a job we were doing. Maria never wrote a book, and I never even wrote hardly anything. And I had met a man, Joseph Pierce, who is an English writer and author. He's a professor. I met him at EWTN a few years ago, before that. And so I got his telephone number, and I called him, and I told him about what I just told you. And he said, "Well, send me the manuscript." And I did, and within a week later, he called me back, and he says, "I read it." And he says, "Robert," he says, "the world needs Rose's story." He says, terribly. He says, "We need to get this out." And he helped me get it published. He got an editor for me. And so these things that aren't so, all these little things that happened, it just inspired me, say, there's something important about what we're doing. Rosie and I worked together our whole life, starting a homeschooling in Louisiana and Alabama. We taught natural family planning. We taught engaged couples conferences, ran a homeschool, wrote letters, and all about family, and motherhood and fatherhood. And I said, God's using her now after her death to keep this going. And so I want to thank you, all you mothers, for all that you do to help spread this book. I said, it's so, and you'll go my clock going, it's so inspiring to get telephone calls from y'all, or emails about how this book affected y'all's life. It's very important that y'all all continue helping me this way, because it wouldn't get out like it is if it wouldn't be for all you good mothers that are inspired by Rose's little writing. I have mothers that buy 50, 30, 20 books at a time. Some bought 100 books, and to get them out. This is very inspiring for me. This keeps me going. And when I get the telephone calls, just last week a lady called me and she wanted several books. And I said, "How long ago you wrote your book?" She said, "Well, I didn't even finish the book." She said, "I started reading it, and about halfway," she says, "and I started crying, and I just ran and hugged all my children and told them I loved them." She says, "Then I brought it to a friend of mine. She says, 'You got to read this,' and then I called you because I want more books." This happens frequently. Some say they read the book in one sitting, and how it affected their life, and want to change and realize they've been cheated. Some of them feel like they've been cheated through higher education instead of being a mother, having careers, professions. I don't want to make this long, so I want to thank you again. I'm going to start making these little videos, try 5-6 minutes at a time, to talk about motherhood and what good that Rosie is doing after her death by her life and writings. And I'm going to share more about this with you. So thank you, and God bless all you good little mothers and y'all's families. And keep giving me calls and emailing me. Let me know what's going on. It really inspires me to keep going. God bless you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.